Welcome to this evening's online roundtable, which has the rather exciting title of Aliens, Vampires, Surrogates, Revolutionising the Gestational Workplace. And I'm really delighted to be able to welcome so many of you this evening. We have among us some of the MA programmes that we run here at Birkbeck, which are associated with the Centre for Contemporary Literature. But this is also a public event that we're hosting. So it's lovely to see friends and colleagues, international and from the UK amongst the audience, and you're all very welcome. I'm so excited about tonight's event to welcome Dr Sophie Lewis from the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and another of my favourite cyborg feminists, Katie Stone, a PhD student here at Birkbeck, who has recently submitted her thesis and is celebrating in style by coming to talk to us all this evening. And we're going to be talking about gestational labour, surrogacy, and why this matters to all of us. So what I've done then is I've asked Katie and Sophie to prepare a few remarks and to talk to us first off, and then we will proceed with a very dialogic kind of loose form discussion. Throughout the evening, you're very welcome to text any questions in the text chat if you like, and you can turn on your camera and microphone if you would like to ask them to Katie and Sophie yourself. Or if not, my colleague, Dr. Peter Fifield, is here with us and he can pass those questions back to us. So we're talking about the gestational workplace and gestational labour. We're going to be thinking about how various monstrous subjects found in utopian and science fiction, from vampires, aliens and parasites to bioengineered Frankensteinian creatures, might offer us suggestive glimpses of the kind of gestational communism that Sophie Lewis has described in her fabulous 2019 book from Verso, which is called Full Surrogacy Now. So perhaps if I could invite Katie to turn on her mic and camera, and she's got some slides to show us. Hi, Katie. So I'll just pop your slides up. Here we go. And ready when you are.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak here. I'm really excited to be here and to be in conversation with Sophie. I guess I should say that a lot of my thought about gestational labour is very indebted to Sophie's work. So I am going to awkwardly quote you in front of you, and you can tell me afterwards if I wildly mischaracterize your position. But yeah, so I'm Katie Stone. I'm just still a PhD student here at Birkbeck, and I'm going to be talking about vampirism and gestational labour, but trying to give a bit of an insight into how I first approached the question of what full surrogacy or the gestational commune might mean, how I've applied it to science fiction, how I think science fiction speaks to it, and then how I think that vampirism might kind of further elucidate this question of what might it mean to have a gestational communism. So I guess for me, this starts with the idea that Sophie raises in her book, The Full Surrogacy Now, of the problem of pregnancy. The idea that pregnancy is itself a problem. So Sophie writes, in the United States, almost 1,000 people die while doing childbirth each year. The situation is social, not simply natural. Things are like this for political and economic reasons. We made them this way. Even in full recognition of the sense of the sublime that people experience in gestating, it is remarkable that there isn't more consistent support for research into alleviating the problem of pregnancy. So I guess lucky that we are here now talking about it. But yeah, this is kind of for me the entryway into the question of what gestational communism might mean and the problem it might solve, which is that the work of pregnancy is work contributes to capital as work, the reproduction of workers, that it is violent, that is dangerous, that is unevenly distributed, and that it doesn't need it to be. I think the emphasis which Sophie places here on the idea of the natural is so important, because I think that the pregnant woman it's not just that it is encoded as natural for women, understood as cis women, to want to be pregnant. It's that the pregnant woman becomes a symbol of what it is to be natural, to be inherent, to be unchangeable, to be outside of the political. And I think in order to make being pregnant better, we have to strongly challenge this position. And I think for me, this is the role that science fiction has, is the ability to intervene in this question. For me, the kind of the greatest strength of science fiction is its ability to estrange, to make strange what is otherwise presented to us as normal or natural. And feminist science fiction specifically addresses the question of reproductive labor and of gestation as that which is presented as normal and natural and unquestionable, and questions it and makes it seem strange. So I've picked out some like very famous feminist science fiction texts from the 60s and 70s. Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, Joanna Russ's The Female Man, and Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time as examples of texts which I think are trying to grapple with the problem of pregnancy, which see it as problematic and work out different ways of doing childbirth. So Ursula Le Guin imagines a world of androgynous aliens who at different times in their lives can take on the role of either gestator or father impregnator. In Joanna Russ's While Away, the utopian, lesbian separatist utopia, people reproduce parthenogenetically, so by themselves, but then raise children collectively. And in Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time, no one gestates children in their bodies. They have ubiquitous use of artificial wombs, and then everyone mothers the children regardless of their gender. And I think all of these are grappling with this problem of pregnancy, and all of them have something to say to us about what gestational communism might look like. Oh, sorry, I've lost the slides. Let me try and get them back. Yes, okay, I've got them back now. So I think that, yeah, they all speak to what we're trying to do here in terms of imagining a gestational communism. They imagine a world beyond the nuclear family with collectivized care. We move away from the idea that the children you gestate are your property, that it is good to gestate children because they will be productive workers. So that's you being productive as well, creating value. And to a degree, they move away from an essentialized understanding of gender. However, I think there is a limitation, an important limitation to this particular approach to gender and to gestation. I think that there is a certain deferral of the gestational commune into an as yet unreachable future in all of these texts. And I think this is illustrated in Woman on the Edge of Time. I think this is the most quoted section of Woman on the Edge of Time and possibly my least favorite. But anyway, this is the character Luciente describing the utopianism, describing the utopian society and why they use these artificial wombs. And so Luciente says, it was part of women's long revolution when we were breaking all the old hierarchies. Finally, there was that one thing we had to give up too, the only power we ever had, in return for no more power for anyone, the original production, the power to give birth, because as long as we were biologically enchained, we'd never be equal. And males would never be humanized to be loving and tender, so we all became mothers. And I think this idea is so deeply anti-utopian, actually, so deeply pessimistic, because rather than presenting gestational communism as something that we could do now, rather than looking at the problem of pregnancy and thinking the problem is about the conditions in which gestators work, the wildly uneven conditions, the kind of care that is given to gestators, the idea that what you're doing when you're gestating is creating value, and all of those things could be changed in the here and now. Instead, what this character, at least, if not Marge Piercy herself, suggests is that biology is enchaining us, that our bodies are such that this gestational commune is absolutely unreachable in the present. It is only if we have artificial wombs, or if we reproduce parthenogenetically in Russ's imaginary, or if we are androgynous aliens who is an entirely non-human physiognomy in Le Guin's world, that reproductive justice is possible. This idea that we'd never be equal as things are now, that males never would be humanized. I mean, it's not just trans exclusionary, it's like wildly pessimistic about the possibilities of what men and women and everyone can do. So this vision of us all becoming mothers is a utopian one, but it's a utopia that it's always deferred. And I think that what vampirism offers to me is a way into pregnancy rather than away from it, a way of looking at the desperate need for care that pregnancy kind of speaks to, the utter dependence of the fetus on the gestating mother, and also the bloodiness and the violence in kind of getting those needs met. I think vampirism looks into that in a way that these feminist utopias tend to look over it, try and leapfrog it, or invent your way out of it. And I guess I wanted to say how I kind of got into this thinking through reading Full Surrogacy Now, because I think that it was this section in particular in which Sophie quotes Kalindi Vora's work, Life Support. I think another really limitation of this feminist utopian model is that it homogenizes womanhood in a way which obscures the ways, the many inequalities, divisions and exploitations within womanhood as a category. So the fact that, as Vora puts it, the reproductive work of women has served not only to perpetuate families in the predominantly white middle class, but also to perpetuate a discourse of white middle class families as needing more care than working class families and other families of colour. And I think that this is kind of a eugenic feminist legacy that you can really see in the feminist utopian, and particularly in the older work like Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland, things like that, but it has its legacy in 70s feminist utopianism as well. Sophie really well, I think, grapples with this question and distinguishes the project of full surrogacy from this kind of eugenic feminism. And she writes, this project, full surrogacy, in contrast, seeks to render such a vampiric zero-sum definition of need literally non-thinkable. It stands for the levelling up and interpenetration of all of what are currently called families until they dissolve into a classless commune on the basis of the best available care for all. So this idea of this classless commune, the dissolution or abolition of families, moving away from, which is accessible, I think, in the here and now, and that's another powerful thing about Full Surrogacy Now, is its emphasis on the utopianism of the present. Is really powerful and has really influenced my thinking. And I just wanted to kind of point to this interesting moment that I had on first reading, where I kind of stumbled on the idea that the zero-sum definition of need, so where the success of the white family, where the success of the white child and the virtue of the white mother's labor is predicated on the suppression of the supposedly like hyper-fecund minoritized working and class and families of color, that zero-sum definition of need was vampiric. And this is like a totally, standard way of using the language of vampirism, right? Because that's what vampirism means, really. It means parasitic and not symbiotic. It means taking without giving back. And yet that kind of didn't chime with my understanding of what vampirism was. So this was kind of, so just briefly, what I'm going to go into is my kind of quest to find a place for vampirism within the gestational commune, which, as I say, I think goes into it rather than attempts to leap over it. I think this is quite an eccentric choice. If we were thinking about particularly Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is what I'm going to talk about, in the context of science fiction, it would not be in the context of feminist utopianism, but rather much older science fictional and anti-feminist science fictional works, which are very much oriented through the white male gaze, which glories in violence against women and displaces the desire for that violence onto a racialized alien other that they can then shoot with a ray gun or stab with a stake, whatever's the most appropriate. And I think that Bram Stoker's Dracula absolutely fits into that model. Jack Halberstam has written about the anti-Semitism in Stoker's formulation of vampirism, and I think that you can certainly see that in the text where Dracula is an illegal immigrant smuggled into the country who then breaks into the bedrooms of young women and attacks them while they sleep. However, what Halberstam also makes clear is that vampirism produces many kinds of monstrosity. It is not just one thing. And so I guess I'm looking into the other aspects of vampirism here. And I just wanted to draw your attention to this particularly, for me, pivotal scene in which the young woman, here Mina Harker, played by Winona Ryder in Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, feeds on Dracula rather than him feeding on her. Here, rather delightedly, in Stoker's text, that delight is suppressed, but this is still a scene from Stoker's novel. There's a scene where the vampire hunters go out in search of Dracula. They see him as this foreign threat to white womanhood and to the white family. And they are endeavoring to attack that threat, to defeat it, to hunt him. They go out on their hunt and they fail. They can't find him, and they return home only to, horror of horrors, find Dracula in the bedroom of dear Madam Mina. And so Dr. Seward describes the scene. He describes Dracula, how with his left hand he held both Mrs. Harker's hands, keeping them away with her arms at full tension. His right hand gripped her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. Her white nightdress was smeared with blood, and a thin stream trickled down the man's bare breast, which was shown by his torn open dress. The attitude of the two had a terrible resemblance to a child forcing a kitten's nose into a saucer of milk to compel it to drink. And I think that this is obviously framed, Dr. Seward frames this as this scene of foreign invasion into the sanctity of white womanhood. Mina is left tearing her hair, screaming that she is unclean. However, there's also another obvious scene that's happening here, which Dr. Seward is resolutely looking away from. Like, yes, Mina's white nightdress is smeared with blood, but also it is Dracula whose bosom is bared. He has a thin stream of blood trickling down his bare breast, shown by his torn open dress. It is Mina who is feeding upon Dracula, feeding from his breast as a child, rather than Dracula who is feeding on Mina. And I think this idea of the terrible resemblance to the child forcing the kitten's nose into a saucer of milk is on Dr. Seward's part a kind of anxious attempt to suppress this image of breastfeeding that he sees before him, which can't help quite letting the child rise up in the image, the veil kind of not fully disguising what we can see in front of us here. And so what I see this as is a scene in which we start to question what Dracula is giving as well as what he is taking. How vampirism is showing not a zero-sum definition of need, but is attempting to grapple with these competing needs and competing hungers. And I think that really comes out in this speech which Mina recounts that Dracula says to her before this scene. Dracula doesn't get that many speeches, so this is Dracula speaking about the vampire hunters. He says they should have kept their energies for use closer to home. You, their best beloved one, are now to me flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood, kin of my kin, my bountiful winepress for a while, and shall be later on my companion and my helper. You shall be avenged in turn, for not one of them but shall minister to your needs. And I'm sort of really intrigued by this idea, not only that Mina is here his child, she is blood of his blood, kin of his kin, she's intimately related to him, he is within her family, but also the idea that she needs vengeance on the other vampire hunters, on the men. And I think that that's so interesting because they don't seem to have done her any direct wrongs. But the wrong that they certainly have done her is extract her labour, is demand her that she care for them. Mina constantly describes themselves as the mother of this group. She talks about how women are inherently drawn to mother men as children. And it's so interesting to me that Dracula frames vampirism as a time in which her needs will be met by the men whose needs she is ministered to. So it's a kind of reversal of the naturalized flow of labor there. And so I see this as a pivotal scene because I see it as a kind of the call is coming from inside the house scene. The vampire hunters are looking for violent exploitation and danger outside of the family home. But as Dracula says, they should have kept their energies for use closer to home. What Dracula shows us is that within the family that this violence is happening. And further, he shows us that it might not have to happen like this, that there might be more reciprocal ways of dealing with this. So he is dangerous and violent and deadly, but that doesn't distinguish him from the gestational workplace as we know it in the heteronormative family under capital. That demonstrates his centrality to that family. So I don't want to go any longer. But I just think that this is a really important part of it, that the extent that Dracula is perverting motherhood or perverting this image of the breastfeeding woman is the extent to which that image, that act is already perverse. So I'll finish on this quotation from the end of Full Surrogacy Now, where Sophie's talking about what she calls amniotechnics. And she asks, who holds and catches whose blood, who rips into whom, gestator or gestatee? What's certain is that monsters rampage because of a lack of care. I call amniotechnics the art of holding and caring, even while being ripped into, at the same time as being held. And I think that this is really, for me, what vampirism allows us. These are the questions it allows us to grapple with, not how can we techno-fix our way out of pregnancy, but how can we encounter it as it is being done and as it could be done more justly, more utopianly. So I'll end there, but thank you very much.
Fab. Thank you, Katie, so much. I'm sure everyone will agree with me that that detailed, close textual analysis is really, really compelling, and a wonderful introduction to and homage to Sophie's work. So Sophie, if you're ready, I'll hand over to you.
Hello. I was having some technical difficulties, but I think my video is staying firm so far.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, as is our wont sometimes in Turtle Island, to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Lenni Lenape peoples. I'm in West Philadelphia. It's 1:30 in the afternoon. I loved that presentation, Katie. I really mean it. I've told you before, but there is no one who I feel understands my book as powerfully as you. Your review is my favorite review. So at the risk of kind of continuing this sort of nested doll, that was Caroline's phrase before we got going, this kind of function of our gestating of thought and politics together. Even more, I'm going to perhaps quote a little bit of your review of my book in front of you. This is, I think, really what I learned from you, in a sense, what I was trying to do. You wrote, and this was at the British Science Fiction Association magazine, Vector, that Full Surrogacy Now, like all good science fiction, is a book about an impossibility. Yeah, you say that I moved from a consideration of the impossible yet actually existing working conditions of professional surrogates, those who carry and give birth to someone else's infant, to the similarly impossible premise under which all gestational labor is undertaken. So yes, in my analysis, you say the reason that bearing an infant for someone else is always a fantasy, a shaky construction, is not because of the uniquely fantastic conditions of commercial gestational surrogacy. Rather, it's attributable to the fact that infants don't belong to anyone ever. I just love your piece. I was remarking earlier that I think my book has kind of changed in aspect and identity since sort of being birthed out into the world. It's these stakes and this kind of appeal to the true spirit of SF utopianism that kind of is pulling me today to think about vampirism. The second thing that you have given me, Katie, is a framework for thinking about so-called parasitism in a way that I feel I ought to have known better than to put in my book zero-sum vampiric, as though those two things are synonyms. So thank you so much for taking me on this kind of journey. I think it was a minor, betrayal of my sort of Harawayvian ethos, my debt to 1980s era Donna Haraway to sort of to make that move. And on that note, unlike perhaps some in this room, I've had the privilege of reading your draft, your essay shortly to be published, unless it's already out, correct me, on Dracula and on the anti-work utopian hunger and gestational communism that can be found in that novel. And of course, you've given us some intimation of the sorts of arguments that you advance there. But yeah, I wanted to affirm that this is something that to continue this kind of nesting dolls image of your thought and mine. And it's I'm really indebted to this argument that the very ambivalent, so not simply good because queer, and therefore somehow romantic kind of hunger of the vampire is a superior way to think, to try and open up the politics of amniotechnics, I guess, right? So it links very much to me to the thought, the kind of instinctive thoughts I was having and hadn't thought through in this way that you do back in that moment in UK politics, which unfortunately then went global, when weirdly enough the left was talking about vampires. And so I don't know, perhaps some people here will know what I'm talking about and some not. I'm talking about the essay by Mark Fisher, Exiting the Vampire Castle. In 2013, the left was sort of briefly consumed by this painful kind of discursive intervention, and it has proved as an essay, persistently potent and polarizing. And I want to just dwell on it for a second. So at that time, the publication of Exiting the Vampire Castle, I would say that the British establishment's characterization of Black feminism and trans rights activism as post-structuralist moralizing was not yet as entrenched as it is today. But nevertheless, despite the fact that Fisher made some, as I would put it, sort of good points, there were many of us, I think, who felt instinctively what side we were on. The theorist Angela Mitropoulos put it this way: I don't see how Marx can, on the one hand, rail against identitarianism and essentialism, while on the other hand offering a concept of class that is nothing more than an identity politics, in this case the identity politics of white men and their rights to go about their enjoyment, their entitlement to treat others as they wish, unhindered by criticism. And I was in this camp, and like Ray Filar, I found it sort of both risible and perhaps not altogether unappealing to indulge in what they call Fisher's fantasy of a vampirarchy, a world full of angry feminist vampires shouting, "Check your privilege," at poor, unsuspecting, powerless, innocent white leftist men. I noticed, and that's at this point 8 years ago, that there was a sort of formation of particularly trans feminist leftists who started declaring themselves proud vampires, and a preference for a life in a vampire's castle compared to life on the elements of the queerphobic class reductionist left. It was not lost on, I suppose, us vampires, that the language Fisher deployed was meant to invoke the vampire imagery in Karl Marx's writings. And Katie, you give a very good account of that trajectory and that imagery in Karl Marx's writings in your essay about Dracula. So Fisher wrote that the vampire's castle feeds on the energy and anxieties and vulnerabilities of young students. In Marx, we see capital as a parasite with an insatiable mouth that drips with children's blood. And I think I share with you a sense that it's a bad move, a confusing move, an obfuscatory move for revolutionaries to characterize capital as monstrous, right? And parasitism as morally reprehensible. Even if, a bit like with the language of family and kinship, right? You can know that it's wrong and still kind of lazily slip into it and make missteps, right? It's a kind of characteristic of utopian endeavor. Sometimes things, we know there are languages that we have not yet developed, and frameworks we have not yet thought to evoke what we mean. And so knowing that, for instance, the phrase, Katie is like family to me, is not what I want to say, is it? That's not what I want to say at all. And yet it might come out of my mouth, because we are the products of history, and we work with the materials we unfortunately have as legacies in our brain. So it has to be said, though, that the way Marx used this trope of monstrosity was the inverse of Fisher's move. And Fisher reached for vampirism in a denunciation of leftist cultures that would subject the working class comedian Russell Brand to a witch hunt, right? And he unironically used that term. And for Fisher, the vampire's castle is a bourgeois, libidinal, discursive configuration, while for Marx, it's the system of relations set in motion by capitalism. It's even the circuit of accumulation itself. Actually, Donna Haraway has a good reading of this. She is an excellent reader of Marx, in fact, and it is something I lament a little bit, that her promise in the very early 2000s of writing a kind of updated account of capital for non-humans didn't really come to pass, right? And instead, she made a move away from political struggle on a kind of on the meta level, and interestingly enough, she returned to the language of kinship as well, which she had expressed a desire to jettison in the late 20th century. She said, "I'm sick of kinship. We need a different kind of metaphor for talking about the ties and bonds that we want to forge." But it proved maybe too hard, right? It is hard. Comradeliness is an incredibly earnest rubric. I've tried to offer it, and I mean, this is maybe a function of the kind of art institutions that I currently earn my living doing talks for, right? But I've actually been told straight up that I can't say that. I can't say comradeliness. It's got a bad reputation in parts of post-Soviet Europe, for example. But I digress. So Donna Haraway summarizes the vampire in Marx is the marauding figure of unnaturally breeding capital, which penetrates every whole being and sucks it dry in the lusty production and vastly unequal accumulation of wealth. Okay, so I think what I've tried to kind of gesture towards here is my sense that Katie and I are both constantly reaching towards something quite tricky to express, which is this kind of cyborgicity, which means contaminatedness, not prettiness, not safeness, not innocence of the labors of gestating that are already here, are already here making the world, and which at the same time, were we to recognize them, realize their potentialities in a communist way, would utterly transform life into something much more abundant and pleasurable, right? So there's this kind of simultaneously here character of full surrogacy now, right? An almost dystopian sense in which full surrogacy is kind of here already, in this way Cullen Devora describes of, vital labors kind of being leached out of the global south and sort of directed very unevenly and wrongfully into the households of the global north, who are also ideologically produced as needing, requiring, deserving all that vital energy, more so than families elsewhere. And so when I say amniotechnics, when Katie says vampirism, we're not talking about something simply happy and nice. It's risky, it's painful, it's agonistic. The reading you have of the vampire is not simply yay, like let's be vampires. It's a hard and dark figure to take up, and it's not simply about redemption and championing, and I love that ability and that method that you have in your writing. And it was that enabled me to think about a best-selling novel about baby making that has recently come out, Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. And so I'll briefly talk about that, and I also want to see if I can link it to a discourse that emerged in the UK around uterine transplants for trans women in 2017. There was a very brutal and illuminating moment in British feminism, where news stories had emerged talking about the possibility of trans women receiving uterine transplants for the purpose of bearing fetuses that they would otherwise not be able to, not having uteruses. And the trans exclusionary radical feminist contingent of of the UK establishment, which has only unfortunately grown, it seems, in virulence since 2017, responded to these stories in a very curious way. And the reason it kind of crossed my radar was partly because they referenced the same evolutionary biologist who I actually use in the very opening pages of Full Surrogacy now. And this seems relevant to me because it gets to the heart of the inability to think ambivalence and the coexistence of work and joy and exploitation and life making, so this thing that wages for housework also gets misunderstood as saying all the time that to quote the immortal lines, they say it is love, we say it is unwaged work. Well, you notice wages for housework isn't saying we disagree. It is not love. They never said that. The problem is that and you could say gestating, if you like, is what they are talking about, for instance, although it has to be said, wages for housework rather distanced itself from gestating as a component of its theorizing of housework. But I realize I have a tendency to digress rhizomatically in all directions before making the end of a statement. So, my book is a response to Wages for Housework's throwaway line almost, every miscarriage is a workplace accident, right? Okay, we can circle back. But so Suzanne Sadadin is not, an autonomous Marxist, as far as I can tell. She's an evolutionary biologist who has a very sort of fine-grained, interesting, controversial way of pushing back against medical frameworks and discourses and ideologies around pregnancy. And it's not, I don't entirely like her account. It was pointed out to me that she uses some of the kind of militaristic language about a war in the womb, which has historically been used by patriarchs, basically, medical patriarchs. But what is interesting is that she insists, when she's not doing that, when she's not using military language, she insists that there's a kind of agonism about placentation in the human species, and that there is generosity and refusal, and a sort of mutual consuming and a kind of excess of hunger that requires the gestator to say no and to defend themselves against the fetus. So this kind of idea of generosity that tends to be linked to pregnancy, to the exclusion of all other kinds of dynamics, has to be complicated, right? It's not to say there is not generosity, but generosity is part of the kind of contingent reasons for which we all exist, right? We don't exist because maternal love, meant of any gender, is natural. We exist because of a contingent choice to gestate us, and likewise everyone else. TERFs and also what I call SERFs, surrogate exclusionary radical feminists, tend to basically boil down to a denial of that idea that there is a kind of contingency to our being. This might seem a bit, I would probably need to develop the whole paper for you that makes this kind of argument clear, but serfs, as I call them, find it very distressing that a child might look at a pregnancy and observe that this pregnancy is waged and that the product of that pregnancy will be separated from the gestator, and then think, oh gosh, I might also be sold and or something like that, and my proposal is, I mean, children already understand that there is labor involved in looking after them, not just nature, and the idea that we need to protect at all costs, this innocence of children, from the fact that there is a kind of a mutually entangled kind of web of nature and labor in the alchemy that makes them, is bogus and is anti-utopian. I realize I've been going on for too long. Thanks for the question, Peter. So I haven't covered the Tory Peters stuff, but I just wanted to flag that I have a piece coming out indebted to Katie about the figure of the vampire in Detransition Baby, who is everywhere once you start looking out for her, and who really kind of embodies that ambivalent kind of sort of hungry, queer, sensuous interdependence, and neediness that Katie brings out and refuses to treat as sinister. Okay, I hope that was okay, Caroline. Very unstructured.
No, thank you. Well, you ended up in a really interesting place talking about the question of the innocence of the figure of the child, which I know is something Katie has spent quite a lot of time deconstructing in her doctoral research. But I guess, I mean, one question that really stood out to me, and I'm very sorry to everybody if I didn't quite contextualize this from the beginning, was how is it that you both came across these, in Katie's work, it's sort of the figure of the child, and in this particular case study, the relationship with vampirism, and in your work, Sophie, it's the outsourcing of genetic parenthood through the international global business of surrogacy. How did you choose those case studies for thinking through what is at its broadest an incredibly utopian project to reimagine social reproduction and to reimagine our relations between one another as mutually entangling and caring, and to abolish the family in favor of a much broader perspective? Did it start with the surrogacy, or did it start with a political position and you came across surrogacy? Because I'm trying to get my head around the particular and the universal, I guess. It feels like surrogacy is this lightning rod that you use that cuts through all of these other layers, which many of our students here would be familiar with, even though they might not have ever studied anything to do with surrogacy and reproductive politics, but they would be familiar with those problems of migrants' crises and people having to cross borders and massive structural inequalities at the global scale. So yeah, how did you come to surrogacy? And Katie, how did you come to the figure of the child? Sophie first.
Okay, me first. Well, that's a really interesting question. I had a PhD proposal that was actually not at all empirically grounded in a case study. It was a sort of anti-work, anti-nature kind of philosophical proposal. And in early, I mean, I don't know how I was ever going to do it, but in early discussions with my supervisors, I actually kind of reached for pregnancy as a sort of off-the-cuff problem to think about, because I take Haraway's Cyborg very seriously, the troubling of the boundaries of the human, while staying kind of Marxist, but these things, I'm convinced, don't contradict one another. I mean, my supervisors thought differently. They said, no, if you want to have the category labor power at the center of your analysis, you have to accept that it's the human who bears it. That's the analysis we have. That's Marx. And I was sort of like, but but you know, then it excludes the gestator, doesn't it? I mean, the word individual literally means, you know, not pregnant. And so I was really fascinated by the possibility that rather than trying to fit gestating into the classic categories of Marxological value analysis, we could perhaps do the inverse, you know, and sort of look at pregnancy and the very deep, intimate. I mean, okay, the danger is also, you know, to overstate and to exceptionalize it in another way and make it kind of the ground zero of everything, which is not what I mean. But there is something sort of generatively, you know, xeno-hospitable and challenging about the nature of gestational work. It's mutual, right? There's a mutual and agonistic and plural, kind of simultaneously alienated and alienating and exploitative and creative and potentially very sort of spiritually and somatically fulfilling kind of cluster of dynamics there. And what if we tried to fit other forms of labor into something like that, into an understanding informed by that, right? And yeah,
which takes that essentializing feminist argument that it's only the pregnant woman who can experience those kinds of feelings, which is incredibly important, I think. And Katie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, I felt that there was an appeal to, in so many different discourses, there was a kind of implied, in like politics, when we're thinking about various kinds of political discourses, there was always a kind of implied outside, which often had like the person of the child. There was also always like the idea of like, this is politics, this is what we're talking about, like we're going to talk about labor, and children don't do labor. There's a time prior to that. And for me, that was really the problem, the implied like ground zero of childhood, right? Where it's like, this is external, this is somehow pure, and it becomes less pure as it goes on. And I think that that's tied in to lots of kind of narratives of progression and maturation, which you find in like a wide range of political discourses, from imperialism to Hegel and then Marx, right? Like this idea that we are moving, we are maturing on, and that there's a kind of fascination with the innocent and pure figure of the child. And I suppose that I always wanted to, that never, again, it's that thing of not understanding how something works, that never really adhered to my understanding of where childhood would sit in that. The idea that childhood was outside of labor, outside of kind of personhood or experience. And you know, maybe there's a kind of obvious biographical reason for that. It's just my parents treated me as a person when I was a child, and I think that had a massive impact upon me. But also, like, I just think that implied outside or prior to is in so much discourse about how you become gendered, about how you become a worker. And I mean, yeah, Sophie's work and Haraway's work and this idea of resisting purity and resisting innocence as an idea became for me about childhood and what childhood, a non-innocent and an impure childhood, could kind of bring to that discussion.
I mean, I was also, thank you, Katie, wondering about coming back to this idea of amniotechnics, which Sophie really beautifully describes, and she's drawing here too on Astrida Naimanis's work and recent developments in hydrofeminism. I wondered if I could put it to both of you, what is it about the concept of water and wateriness and bodies of water to which we may all belong that is so rich in utopian potential for your respective projects?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump back in. Why not? Yeah. So with Beyond Gender, so I'm part of a research collective called Beyond Gender, who look at queer and feminist science fiction. And for our first actually collective chapter that we wrote together, there are some people in the audience here as well, who have worked on this. But we wanted to write a piece for a book which is going to come out called The Technologies of Feminist Speculative Fiction. And we wanted to write a chapter about queer and trans science fiction and how that spoke to this question of the technologies of feminism. And I think I just read Full Surrogacy now, so I was all hyped on amniotechnics, and we all read it together. But I think it was also important for us to think about how the language of wateriness is so often tied to an essentialized understanding of gender, a kind of earth, mother, nature idea of there is a woman's body and wateriness is womanly, and that didn't at all, again, adhere to our understanding of what wateriness might mean. And it's this kind of bizarre denial of the wateriness that is everywhere, and that wateriness maybe speaks to, I mean, in amniotechnics, Sophie speaks about this idea of the wateriness protecting from water while being immersed in water, it's like not drowning, while also embracing one's own wateriness. And so the idea of the porous boundaries that are required to manage this wateriness, which I think is connected to the idea of the vampirism, right? Holding while being cut into, is connected to that idea of we are breathing one another's water all of the time. And so for us, that was a way of saying we will not cede the ground of wateriness to an essentialized feminism. We are going to demonstrate how that is so important for queer and trans speculation and queer and trans technologies. So yeah, I guess in the same way that I'm like the vampire refuses to leave the pregnant woman and the heteronormative family as a kind of a ground in which it was just inherently reactionary or inherently anti-utopian and kind of intervenes in it. I think that we were trying to do a similar thing for this idea of wateriness.
Yeah. I echoing all of that. I think the valence of water is sometimes completely misrepresented. I suppose this is, Haraway is so good at kind of showing that, we need not be as utopian feminists scared of biology, because when you learn about biology, there's just all kinds of stuff there that paradoxically people feel that they already know, and they're wrong, right? Biology is only a sort of it's complicated. I've also just taught a course on Shulamit Firestone, who really believes that the biological kind of apparatus that our species has to work with needs to be biohacked and transformed materially, biophysically, which echoes what the quote from Marge Piercy that Katie had, which I agree is very anti-utopian in a sense, right? Because of the present tense of utopian kind of endeavor. But yeah, so water is misunderstood in some forms of feminism as somehow just beautiful, just friendly towards all living beings. And I quote in my amniotechnics chapter this kind of radical midwife, Lakota midwife, Autumn Lavender Wilson, who says that Mni Wishoni, that sort of famous phrase, is not some fluffy abstract concept designed to fuel some hokey pseudo-spiritual practice. Water has the power to heal, and contaminated water has the power to kill, and clean water has the power to drown us. And we are manufactured, all of us, in underwater, in tanks, if you like, in permeable, porous, fleshy tanks, and yet, as soon as we get expelled from that tank, we cease to be able to breathe underwater, and it's water kills us. Like it's very dangerous for the gestator as well to be in this condition of being sort of potentially floodable from the inside, right? This is kind of part of why gestating kills 300,000 people a year, which is not a kind of statistic that in any other sector or industry we would think is fine, like, to quote Donald Trump, maybe we should sort of suspend this thing until we've figured it all out, until we've figured out what's going on. Like round the corner from where I live here in Philadelphia, there is a research unit that has been working on the biobag. I have an article about this. It was very difficult to get them to talk to me. Well, ultimately impossible to get the researchers to talk to me, because I started talking about my interest in, ill-advisedly, I shouldn't have mentioned this, and they stonewalled me in the end. But I'm interested in ectogenesis. There are hugely kind of challenging and potentially sort of inspirational and remarkably kind of low tech, easy to replicate aspects of this prototype, which is currently being used on lambs, and is only being funded, I have to say, right? And Firestone was clear on this kind of danger. She was not the techno-determinist people sometimes make her out to be. In the hands of the current powers and interests, fueling this kind of research into artificial gestating, it's not going to be emancipatory for anyone. It's purely there to sort of advance an agenda of fetal personhood, so that you could potentially start treating a fetus as a patient. It's not there to sort of empower people to not gestate if they don't want to, right? It's there for preemie neonatal humans to be rescued from the hostile or failing uterine environment. Okay, shutting up now.
Wow. I didn't realize we would get a connection between abortion and the manufacture of lamb and sheep in the biopacks. I wasn't quite prepared for that one. We do have some questions starting to come in. Madeline, I've just seen one from you. Do you want to ask it yourself, or I can read it out for you? She's asking Katie to say more about the critique of the trope of innocence in the imagination of children.
So this idea of thinking about the imagination of children, and I mean, this is a really, really interesting question. So yeah, my thesis is about childhood in science fiction, and I look particularly at the idea of childhood curiosity. So curiosity kind of in the doubled sense of both inquisitive and strange. And for me, I think in order not to kind of veer off into the kind of maybe more vapid utopian territory of like vampires are queer and they're good, like children, they're so good, like that kind of utopianism of just thinking that stuff is uncomplicatedly good. I think that there is something particular about the childish imagination, not just how we imagine the child, but how children might imagine, that speaks to that science fictional effect of making strange, of looking at what is accepted as normal or natural and thinking about how it isn't so. And I think it can quite easily, you can quite easily recede into this sense of, oh, we'll look to the children and we'll follow them and we'll follow what they do and they will lead us, which often is, I mean, I think it's very prevalent, particularly in kind of eco-critical narratives of like the young generation, they know what to do. And I think that that's to be resisted, because it's just a ceding of responsibility and a failure to acknowledge like our own continuing childishness. And I think that, so for me, the kind of the inquisitiveness has to come with the strangeness as well, essentially, that you can be curious in a way that probes at the world and probes at the naturalness that is presented as inevitable and see its strangeness, but only in the acknowledgement that you are yourself strange, that it's kind of you're positioning yourself then as something that is strange as well. And hopefully, to me, that kind of double movement stops you from just going into a version of children are not innocent, but they are utopian, and thus they're good, and that becomes a kind of stand-in for innocence. And I hope that this kind of doubled curiosity is a way out of that, and as well as the thing of saying, I don't think children are just young people. You know, I think that our construction of what is a child is like constantly shifting. So yeah, I guess that's my start to an answer of that question.
Thanks. Peter, have we got some questions from a bit earlier on in the session?
There is one, yes, by Josie Taylor, who just put her hand up. So I'll let Josie read or reformulate it as she wants. Josie, go ahead. We can't hear you. I don't know whether you're speaking. It says that your microphone's on.
Ah, okay.
Would you like me to read out your the question from earlier about Octavia Butler? Maybe while you type, I could start with that. It says, hi both, thank you so much for both your wonderful talks, truly fascinating ideas. I was wondering what either of you thought of Octavia Butler's work, particularly in Lilith's Brood, in relation to reproductive labour.
Katie, I feel like you're more acquainted than I am. You're the SF expert, and I've really only engaged with the short story Bloodchild, which I'm keen to talk about, but you go first.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the Bloodchild is, yeah, I mean, is a great kind of study in full surrogacy now of Bloodchild, and it is most obviously her work that engages with the idea of surrogacy and the kind of the horror in the face of gestation. But I think not just the horror. Like, I'm interested in how Octavia Butler is looking in this intense way. Another person who is not afraid of biology. She is really looking at bodies and what they do. And is kind of disgusted by it and fearful of it, but still looking. And I think that is a really significant aspect of her work. Yeah, Lilith's Brood is a kind of amazing sequence, which has a kind of another alien race, but I think unlike Le Guin's Gestational, they have a three-gendered race who are themselves gene splicers, the Onkali, and they, in their bodies, they are able to manipulate DNA, and they have kind of 5-person families, which include the humans. So this reaching out from human to non-human, and there's, I mean, very, very complicated dynamics between the humans and the aliens. It's a kind of colonization project, but a colonization which is also an attempt to save Earth and save the remnants of humanity from a nuclear holocaust. I guess one of the things that I find really interesting about it is that Octavia Butler chooses, her main character is called Lilith, and I think that this is very influential influential on Haraway's formulation of Lilith as this important like anti-Eve figure. So Lilith is a mother, but she's not like the innocent original mother who is meant to be outside of society. She's kind of an always fallen mother. And I think that that's really significant in terms of what Butler thinks that motherhood might mean, and the complicated relations that it will entail, including dealing with aliens, both kind of fetal and actually alien in Lilith's brood. But yeah, I'm very interested to hear what Sophie has to say about Bloodchild as well.
Well, thanks. I had to cut lots about Bloodchild from my book in the end, and perhaps I'll resurrect it in a, who knows, co-authored piece with you. Just saying. So yeah, I'm really interested in the coexistence of kind of coercion and consent, which is like a characterization of almost everything under capitalism, right? And somehow in certain fields, including sex, as with sex worker, exclusionary radical feminist politics, and pregnancy, that hybridity is just intolerable, like really not tolerated by feminist discourse in general. Well, which is currently dominated by these kinds of liberal, whore-phobic, and productivist sorts of assumptions, right? And I think the anti-work thing is very kind of core. Both of us, I think, ultimately start zeroing in on the very kind of productivist image of the human body that lurks behind our antagonists, right? The people that we want to critique and move beyond their imaginaries. I realized that I never really closed the loop on my remarks about Fisher and detransitioned baby. Perhaps I can just shoehorn in some things. Yeah, I mean, so you sort of said some of this, but I wanted Mark Fisher to still be alive to read Detransitioned Baby, partly because that novel has so much in it about the kind of the traumatized and yet utopian nature of many people that I think he thought were unlike him, but actually perhaps should have been his comrades. I wondered if Detransitioned Baby might have changed Mark Fisher's mind about vampires, basically, because not only is it a novel about sort of unnatural breeding and about the twinned violence of sort of cisness and outsiders of cisness's kind of thwarted desire for cisness, but it's also about the insufficiency of what a trans person sarcastically calls in the novel the queer kinship spiel, right, in marginalized communities. Again, you've touched on this, but I was sort of thinking, Mark, after all, what is a vampire, right? And I mean, the field of European literary studies has proposed many answers. A queer menace to the nuclear family, someone who wants to penetrate bodies and reproduce asexually, and as you show in Dracula, might actually attract children and make children feel safe and make children desire to play rather than terrorize them and repel them. And that's the real fear, isn't it? A race traitor, a racial other, a degenerate danger to the nation, a scion of a dying aristocracy. And then equally, and I had this in mind when I read Joni Cohen's essay, which is fantastic, about the figure of the transsexual woman in the Nazi imaginary as an analog for the figure of abstract value. Go and read that essay. It's fantastically relevant. The figure of the vampire might also be just to sort of proliferate the characters even more: surrogate, vampire, cyborg, Jew, transsexual woman. You know, the vampire can be read as a sinister Jewish figure, including with the sort of blood libel link, and a stand-in for abstraction itself, right? Which can then be sort of opposed to the putatively sort of healthful realm of the concrete, which is also the realm of proper productivity. And I think that's core to your argument about Dracula. So there are all these reasons to sort of try and partially reclaim vampires as anti-nationalists and family abolitionists and you know, migrant contaminants and you know, devotees of pleasure, because they're non-procreative reproducers, and they're maybe communizers of blood itself, reminiscent of that kind of Bolshevik physician Alexander Bogdanov's proposals for a sort of universal proletarian blood exchange via transfusion. So sorry to steal this time, but my point is that crucially, you know, the vampire is not, as Fisher mistakenly charged, a finger-wagging sermonizer of, quote, sour-faced identitarian piety, right? She is thirsty, needy, dependent, sensuous, vulnerable, constantly multiplying, kind of via kisses, and dangerously anti-bourgeois, full of unnatural appetites. And yeah, she's a queer feminine version of it, but surely she's kind of that, quote, cool, sexy avatar of communism Fisher was nostalgic for in his very depressed blog post. So, you know, I just think that's kind of the core part of gestational communism, is understanding that mothers are traumatized, right? And that's part of why they need to be multiple. That, you know, we need many mothers, partly for the sort of pragmatic reason that we need a bit of an insurance strategy against isolation within the private nuclear household, with you know, a single individual's set of damage, right? Okay.
Yeah, I couldn't thank. Brilliant. I'm so pleased that we're recording this, because I feel like Sophie and Katie, between you, have just brainstormed a fantastic paper come pamphlet that all of us would love to read about reclaiming the vampire. And the way in which you were describing that you know, this figure, the sort of sexy anti-bourgeois, collectivizing the blood, abolishing the family, engaging in sensual bodily pleasures for the purposes not of reproduction. It comes back actually to a question that I had from my colleague here, Professor Joe Brooker, who was asking if both of you could describe what your positive vision of pregnancy and family would look like. And I guess Joe's question, I don't know if he wants to turn on his microphone, might be rooted slightly more in political terms. Are there specific examples or case studies? I mean, Sophie, you do mention some in your book of various kinds of figures, including midwives and others who would be part of this gestational communism.
Oh, I've just been talking so long. I do find that particular question a bit challenging sometimes. It's this thing that Katie was talking about the sort of imminent kind of between the cracks of the present kind of characteristic of the gestational commune. You know, there are, you know, the best parents, perhaps Katie was suggesting she received some of this kind of parenting, already are, you know, not just non-proprietary, but perhaps anti-proprietary, you know, really sort of rejecting the idea that care is contingent upon a sort of you know, biological or genetic property, and you know, the ethos of kind of belonging to everybody and being each other's harvest, and being at stake to one another and being the makers of one another is kind of visible. We can glimpse it everywhere. I find it difficult to point to, you know, an example of a commune that was just, you know, fantastic, let's all do that. I don't think there is such a thing that I know of, but I'm inspired by, for instance, Emma Heaney's recent essay, which is called "Is a Cervix Cis?" And she describes all of these kinds of conversations and experiential sort of crossovers between, as she puts it, friends, all of these women, some of whom are not women, some have the same organs and structures that I have, some do not. Some are modifying their bodies with the same substances with which I am modifying my body, and we're there together listening to one another. Right, so this kind of ethos of kind of gender noughts, gestating both literally and not literally, and holding one another in a kind of conjoined process of sort of world making and unmaking, right? There are also things we need to unmake and people we need to almost like unproduce, if you like. I'm sorry, that's a very vague answer. I apologize. Maybe Katie will have something more.
I mean, I have a similarly vague answer, I think. I think I wanted to kind of, clarify my critique of Marge Piercy's position, because I think that, as Sophie was saying, like, and in the work of Shulamith Firestone, there are, and from a detransition baby is a great example of this, about the possibility of kind of transfeminist biohacking is really significant and important. I don't at all kind of mean to say that it's like, oh, Marge Piercy thinks that we should hack bodies, but no, they're just good as they are. Like, I don't think that at all. I think that can absolutely be an important part of the way in which we denaturalize our bodies. We denaturalize gestation, and we rethink what it means to hold one another. I just think that there is a deferral of this and this kind of despair of like, males will never be humanized until this happens, and I just think that's like ludicrous, despite the insufficiencies of the present. But I guess to Joe's question about how are people doing this now, or how could they do it? I think it is this sense of that people already are doing it in these various and important ways, which so frequently goes kind of unacknowledged in our understanding of what the family is. I mean, I was thinking about Kathy Cohen's work on the idea that heterosexuality is not this kind of amorphous, homogenized blob of heteronormative privilege. It's actually kind of imbricated with queerness and with queer communities, and particularly, and there's a lot of amazing work on the kind of how Black feminism and trans feminism, and Che Gossett writes about this, speak to one another in such important ways, and that this idea of maybe Black feminism was always trans is this idea to me of, yeah, again, not saying, oh yeah, there is the family and we know what that's like, and that's worthless, it's anti-revolutionary, it's not queer, and we need something new and different, absolutely a clean break with the past. And I think this sense of the vampire or the gestational communist is opposed to that vision of or belief that it's possible to have an absolute and clean break, because I think it's a mirror of the idea of the pure and innocent child is the pure and innocent child of the future, who will be the revolutionary child, untouched by the family of the present. And I think that, not in order not to abolish the family, but just to understand our kind of always imbrications within it. So yeah, I guess that would be my my response to that question.
Yeah, and there's so many fascinating parallels, aren't there, with the way in which these families are not just reproduced in social, ideological, terms, but I was thinking along the lines of kind of architectural terms and urban planning and the problems that we have with the ways in which our domestic spaces are arranged. So even if you wanted your family to be slightly more gestationally communist, it's not always possible in that very materially rooted sense that we are forced into particular kinds of socialities because of the spaces that are available to us. So there's so many different directions in which this kind of conversation could go. We've got a question here from Lucy. Lucy asks, could you respond to Maggie Nelson's quotation about the seduction of normalcy? Why would queer parents feel like they have to avoid it? Sorry, Lucy, here she is.
Sorry, I can explain my question, that might be easier. Yeah, I guess, hi, both Katie and Sophie and Caroline. I guess my question was that I've been looking at Maggie Nelson's The Argonaut, and she talks about pregnancy being in itself inherently queer as an experience, in the same way that you were kind of talking about, Katie, as the strange. And then she does talk about, so she considers her family queer. She is in a queer relationship. She's with someone who's gender fluid, but she is also in a family who from the outside would look very much heteronormative. And there was a lot of kind of backlash when the book came out of, is her way of talking about the queer family and the queer pregnancy a sort of palatable way for the straights to look at the queer family, if that makes sense? Like, oh, look, even the queers are doing like us. So I guess that was sort of the first thing. And also, I got the sense that there's also a sort of almost like a class issue, whereas, you know, if you are relying on a extended network of care, usually it's because of, well, there's a question of necessity, as you were talking about with, you know, Black mothers, for example, and it's not something that's seen as a choice. It's something that comes out of necessity. So how do we change the nuclear family into, like, how, you know, not only what people can afford, in a way, if that makes sense, and like can see the kinship as an ideal structure rather than a structure born out of necessity. Hopefully that makes sense. Sorry.
I'm happy to just jump in quickly because I've just remembered what I was going to say about Joe's previous question. I think it connects to the question Lucy asked. I think I'll leave you to talk about Maggie Nelson, Sophie, because you've written about her work. But I think this idea of whether this idea of it takes a village to raise a child is kind of something that Sophie talks about in Full Surrogacy Now, and it's also something that's at the heart of Naylor Hopkinson's novel The Salt Rose, which we wrote about as Beyond Gender, and it's the idea that yes, we are all already doing this, like even despite the privatization of the nuclear family, despite these kind of proprietarian models of kinship, no one is really just raising their child themselves. They are all already, so, you know, thinking about the people who deliver food, or the cleaners in buildings that you go to, like all of these people who are sustaining the economies in which you live, those people are contributing to your children, whether you kind of acknowledge their participation, their labor or not. And so I think it's important, I guess, in the same way that we're kind of ambivalently looking at surrogacy or vampirism, to acknowledge that, yeah, one aspect of this communal living is this exploitation of gig workers, for example, in order to, which is then not acknowledged. So it's using a family to raise a child is not always a utopian endeavor, and that is also true in terms of, as you say, Lucy, the people who would like to spend much more time with the children that they have gestated, but are unable to do so because of their need to often care for other people's children in order to sustain their lives. So yeah, it's again that question of not approaching it for me with this sense of I don't think choice is maybe that useful, and that's what I was going to say when I was thinking about Joe's question, that that one of the examples would be that the queer kinship spiel would be about chosen family, right? And I think that I agree that Octavia Butler is a really useful person to think about this, because I think she's very serious about questioning how useful choice is, despite the many thousands of essays about Bloodchild that are like, can you really consent to this though? And it's like, but it's always on this individualized level of, can this individual person consent to this, rather than what are the structures which like prohibit our ability to gain agency in any of these than any of these questions. So I guess, yeah, it's less to me about being like, how can we give people more choices, and more about acknowledging the ways in which that they are already doing this multiple co-gestational labor, and working out things that would actually serve their needs better, which I guess is different to choice in my sense of it. But yeah, sorry, that was a bit muddled. Yeah.
Oof, yeah, there's so much here. Thank you, Katie and Caroline. I've just found this so rich, and I hope our effervescence has sort of been possible to follow for the audience or whatever. But you know, so in relation to that point about I'm just going to quote Laura Briggs from Lucy's question. So that there is even a relationship between material well-being and childbearing is a 20th century middle class and to some extent white belief, right? That's the historian Laura Briggs. And there is, you know, there is a way that I sometimes try and articulate the dialectical kind of nature of, you know, family abolition, where I sort of make a bit of a concession and you know, I say families against the family, right? Real families against the family, you know, because this is a reframing of part of what Katie was sort of gesturing towards, which is that, you know, paradoxically, the sort of the finest arts of, you know, socially reproducing one another have taken place at the periphery, you know, out in the terrains and territories excluded from the private nuclear household and the nuclear family as an organizing ideal, as an aspirational order, right, and as an economic mechanism for sort of legally, you know, letting people in through borders and giving them certain kinds of benefits and so on. And so that kind of, you know, this is what abolition, you know, to nerd out a little bit, means, you know, it's this simultaneously kind of preservation and destruction. There are those beautiful things that, you know, sometimes maybe exist in bourgeois households, but often have been developed, you know, through those of us who were never meant to survive, as Audre Lorde put it, you know, in fact, finding out how to thrive, right, surthrive or something. And so, you know, yeah, I mean, there's this always already kind of present among us kind of characteristic that has been touched on several times now. And, you know, in Katie's review of Full Surrogacy Now, she talks about this kind of the way that I briefly locate this kind of almost uncanny presence of the surrogate in these sculptures by Patricia Piccinini, where she rightly says the question is not whether, you know, surrogates will intimately produce us one day, but rather, you know, how we should respond to them and hold them since they're already here. You know, and reciprocal baby making is the title of this essay. It's the stuff of impossibility, and it's also happening right now. And then there's this great quote from Sun Ra, you know, we can only hope that when you've achieved one impossible, the others come together to be with their brother. Or in this case, Katie says, with their multiply parented sorrow sibling.
I thought every roundtable should end with a reference to Sun Ra, or possibly some of the music that he produced. And that brings us really neatly back to the kind of science fictional. And I've so much enjoyed this discussion, but I think it's really helpful for those of us who work in science fiction studies to think beyond just the genre of sci-fi and utopian literature as a sort of overlapping set of subgenres, and to use science fiction as a kind of mode of discourse and of critique, and then to start thinking how other areas of theoretical and critical inquiry can be read as science fictional. And even if, Sophie, as you've said, you don't have a background in science fiction per se, but that doesn't mean that your work isn't inherently science fictional in its revolutionary abolitionist sense. And I love the productive overlap that we can find between different pockets of scholarly inquiry in that way. So thank you. I can't thank these two wonderful Cyborgian women enough for really such a generous and passionate and enthusiastic and effervescent discussion. Thank you so much to everybody who came this evening. Sorry if anybody had Wi-Fi issues, but we have recorded it and we will make that recording available. We're getting lots of delighted responses. So Sophie and Katie, I hope you can see some of the comments that everybody's been saying. So yeah, brilliant. MA students among you, we will see you next Wednesday evening for a session on dissertations. But once again, please just virtually bring your hands together to thank Katie and Sophie for their time. Yeah, and take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Well,